With the release of the Eternals on the horizon, many people are sitting around wondering just who the heck the bad guy is gonna be. While the most recent trailer gave us a glimpse of him, most people don't really know who that was supposed to be. Well, that is Kro, leader of the Deviants. Still at a loss for who the heck that is? I can understand that. I mean, the guy isn't exactly a well-known comic baddie, at least as far as mainstream audiences are concerned. Luckily enough for you, I have pretty much nothing better to do than read years worth of comic back issues to figure out who he is for myself so that I can turn around and tell you all about him. So sit back and relax as I break down who Kro is at his core, from his comic history through his powers and weaknesses, all the way up to the present day and how he might factor into the larger MCU as a whole. So let's go ahead and dive right into it. So to really explain who Kro is and what he can do, we should probably start things off by talking a bit about his comic history. So let's go ahead and do that. Kro debuted alongside the Eternals in 1976 in Eternals #1, though if you really want to split hairs, he technically appeared quite a while before that. Back in 1940, there was an issue of Red Raven Comics that featured the character Pluto, as in the Roman god Pluto. While he was largely treated as a separate character through his appearances, this Pluto would later be retconned to actually have been Kro in disguise. So I guess he technically first appeared back in 1940. Anyways, with all of that nonsense out of the way, Kro was born millennia ago on the long-forgotten continent of Lemuria, to a race of beings known as the Deviants. Now, the Deviants were a sort of offshoot of humanity, quote-unquote cursed with biological instability, meaning that each one of them was born with unique mutations, giving them powers and such. Kinda sounds vaguely inhuman-ish, but they're different, trust me. Now, Kro's mutations were even more unique even amongst the Deviants, granting him abilities much closer to that of the Eternals, namely immortality to a certain degree. Now, Kro's invulnerability allowed him to survive things that many of his deviant brethren were not able to, such as the Great Cataclysm, where the Celestials came down to Earth and decimated the Deviant Empire, sinking Lemuria into the sea. Over the next 20,000 or so years, Kro made his way through the world, hiding his immortality from others by constantly changing his appearance and taking on whole new identities. Now, some of his most noteworthy identities across these years were the aforementioned Pluto and even Satan himself. In fact, you could probably argue that he more than likely inspired biblical depictions of the devil. Now, at some point in prehistory, Kro met and fell in love with Thena, daughter of the leader of the Eternals, who were themselves another divergent race, one that had long been sworn enemies of the Deviants. Now, due to the bad blood between the races, these two were forced to separate, for their love was forbidden. Some real Romeo and Juliet stuff going on there. Now, this relationship would go on to complicate things over the years, as the two would eventually come into conflict on more than one occasion. Flash forward to the modern day, when the Celestials once again came to Earth. This time, Kro hatched a plan where he disguised himself as the devil once again, and attacked New York. The purpose of which was to bring humanity into the conflict, making it seem as though the Celestials were a threat to them. Shortly thereafter, the Deviant ruling class, along with Kro himself, led an assault on Olympia, the home of the Eternals, and not just a city in Washington. They initially succeeded, but were stopped when James Rhodes, operating at this time as Iron Man, stepped in and helped the Eternals take it back. Kro managed to escape, but nearly the entire rest of the Deviant ruling class were sent into space by the Eternals. Now, with all their rulers out of the picture, Kro made a play for the throne, but had to contend with Priest Lord Gower, another Deviant who managed to not get tossed into space as part of an atomized cube. While the priesthood were not actually allowed to be king, they were the ones who held the power to name the new one. So Gower agreed to make Kro king, but in the background, he continued his dastardly schemes to claim power for himself. Now, Kro and Thena did eventually rekindle their relationship, leading to what might be the most complicated relationship in all of comics, and something that we might see on the big screen. Now that you have a basic understanding of who Kro is and what he has done within the comics over the years, it would probably be helpful to know what exactly he is capable of. He isn't just an immortal being after all. Remember how I said that each Deviant has mutations that grant them unique powers? Well, Kro is no different in that regard. However, what makes him different from most Deviants is the fact that his particular mutations make him far more like an Eternal than his fellow Deviants. In fact, he's basically an evil version of the Eternals, which is kind of appropriate, since we know that a classic way of creating a threatening enemy for a hero is to just have the bad guy be basically the same as the hero, but flipped morally. Anyways, as far as his powers, we've got to start off with his invulnerability. This is achieved through a rather unique process. Basically, Kro has complete mental control over the cells in his body, allowing him to dictate how they behave and even how they decay. This does a few things for him. Mainly, he can and has stopped aging entirely, but he can also have his cells rapidly heal any damage done to him, making him seemingly immune to being wounded. It also makes him effectively immune to toxic materials, as he can simply have his cells reject any of the damage that it would inflict on him. However, while he may seem to be indestructible, he isn't completely without weakness. It is possible to destroy his cells, which would render him effectively dead. For example, the Eternal Icarus once nearly killed him by strangulation, which would actually make sense. If he isn't getting any oxygen, then neither are his cells. And if his cells aren't getting any oxygen, they can't really do much for him. Now, theoretically, you could also take him out by completely reducing his cells to atoms, disintegrating him, since again, if his cells are completely gone, so is he. So the next time you have a Deviant infestation, think about bringing a giant death ray or a Star Trek phaser or something like that. You might need it. But Kro isn't just immortal. His mental control over his cells also grant him a rather interesting ability. See, Kro can change the shape of his body at will, taking on new forms whenever he wants. This is how he managed to disguise himself throughout history. However, this shape-changing ability has a few limitations. First of all, he cannot change his skeleton beyond small, minor tweaks. So no, he probably isn't going to turn himself into a quadrupedal monster and chase you down anytime soon. He also cannot change his actual mass while changing form. He can't increase it nor decrease it, simply shift it around. He will always be roughly the same size and weight no matter what he chooses to change himself into. Beyond all that, Kro is also super strong, able to lift around 800 or so pounds by himself, and also has physical endurance beyond that of even an Olympic athlete. Couple that with the fact that he is a trained fighter and a master tactician with thousands of years of tactical knowledge, you've got yourself a rather formidable foe. Now that you know who Kro is and what Kro can do, you are probably wondering what kind of role he might play in the Eternals movie. Or maybe you're thinking bigger, wondering how his presence in the MCU will affect things going forward at all. Well, I don't have any kind of insight into the movie just yet, which is still a little ways off from release as of this recording, so I can't answer that exactly. But what I can do is some of my patented wild and wacky speculation. Okay, so based upon what we know of his comic history and what the Eternals seem to be setting up, I'm gonna guess that the film will be a loose adaptation of the Fourth Host event, where the Celestials came down to Earth in order to test the races that they created. So theoretically, in this situation, Kro will use his shapeshifting abilities to try to manipulate humanity into conflict against the Celestials, just like we saw him do in the comics. Either that, or he'll see the arrival of the Celestials as an opportunity to take out the Eternals, doing something similar to what happened when the Deviant ruling class sacked Olympia. Either of these seem like fairly viable plot lines. But what would Kro doing either of those things really amount to? What kind of long-lasting effects would it have on the MCU at large? Well, ultimately it would make the world not only aware of the Celestials, but the Eternals themselves. Granted, at this point, people in that world know that spacefaring beings are out there. They've seen Thor, the Chitauri, Thanos, but seeing the Celestials, beings that to your average person would appear to be basically gods, would certainly have wide-ranging effects on the universe. Not to mention the fact that the Eternals would no longer be able to hide. They'd be out in the open. And with that would come the responsibilities that you would expect. How that'd tie into the whole multiverse timeline-based shenanigans that Phase 4 seems to be building towards, I have pretty much zero idea. But I am sure that the folks over at Marvel will figure it out at some point. They have shown us that they are masters at building towards things, so I guess we'll just have to wait and see. Well, hey there everybody, I'm John Aljits. I made this video, and I want to know what you think. How do you think that Kro will factor into the larger MCU, if at all? Let me know in the comments below or shoot me a response over on Twitter. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks for watching and be sure to subscribe to CBR for more great videos in the future.